Great. So hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us in our session today on getting started applying behavioral science and embedding it in organizations. It's another session of UN Behavioral Science Week. We're on the fifth and final day with our session today. For those of you who haven't seen me in the webinars throughout the week or before, my name is Mary McLennan. I'm a behavioral scientist, and I work with the Executive Office of the Secretary General. And I also lead an initiative called the UN Behavioral Science Group, which I'll speak to in a few moments. But just while colleagues are joining, I wanted to speak very briefly about the week. As I said, we're on the final day, but just to say the week brought together 18 entities in 21 sessions, and they will all be recorded and available on our YouTube playlist. So if you want to check out ones maybe you didn't get a chance to throughout this week, there are sessions ranging from health, climate, peace and security, gender. I encourage you to check those out. We can put the link in the chat for you to see them in your own time. So just a little bit about behavioral science across the UN to situate ourselves in this event and some of the broader behavioral science initiatives. So the UN Behavioral Science Group brings together over 1,000 colleagues from over 60 entities in 110 countries. These colleagues range from those who are new to behavioral science, thinking about how to embed it in a project or take the idea forward, through to ones who are actually behavioral scientists themselves. So there's a spectrum in the group. However, most colleagues are at the early stages of that journey, and that's where we really try to meet them where they are. So how we support is we bring colleagues together across the UN system and beyond in events such as the one we're having today. And we also provide thought leadership, and I'll speak to a few of our initiatives there. And then we provide light touch support on projects as well. So if you've been following behavioral science in the UN over the last few years, it's probably not the first time you've heard that the UN Secretary General has recognized the importance of behavioral science in the UN. And I'm not going to talk about this in detail because one of our speakers today will go to it in much more. But I will say that if you are curious to know more about this, there is a guidance note that was developed last year. It outlines more of the Secretary General's vision, and I encourage you to check it out. So just briefly, if you're interested in engaging more with behavioral science in the UN, 3 things you can do. So first, read the Secretary General's guidance note. Second, read the UN Behavioral Science Report, which covers the experiences of 25 UN entities, as well as some enablers for behavioral science in the UN. And then lastly, just this week, we launched the UN Behavioral Science Practitioner's Guide to Getting Started. And it basically outlines step-by-step how to apply behavioral science. It builds on a decade of literature from academia, governments, and other spaces. And we've really worked to tailor it to the UN context. So that guide is hopefully a resource for all of you. It's developed by the UN and for the UN. Secondly, join the UN Behavioral Science Group. So as I said, we bring together over 1,000 colleagues. It's easy to join. It's just a couple minutes on our website. And if you're outside the UN, you can join as well in an observer role. And then lastly, you can follow us on Twitter under UN_BSci or UN_innovation to get a more real-time understanding of what's going on in the UN system. So with that, on to our session for today. So we'll have our opening speaker and a panel, but we will be collecting questions for Q&A at the end throughout the webinar. And we ask you put them in the Q&A box, not the chat, but the Q&A box. That's will be collecting questions at the end. And there'll be lots of time for discussion then. So just wanted to flag that point of organization for today. And then on to our opening speakers. So we're very fortunate to have with us an individual who knows quite a bit about behavioral science, particularly at senior levels of the UN. It's Ayaka Suzuki. She's the Director of Strategic Planning and Monitoring Unit in the Executive Office of the Secretary General. She's also previously was the Chief of Staff in the Department of Peacekeeping and Operations and the Department of Field Support in the UN headquarters. Prior to this, she's worked in many countries and senior levels, from Libya to Haiti and across Africa as well. So we're very fortunate to have Ayaka with us today, and I will turn it over to her for her remarks at this time. Thank you, Ayaka.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary, for the kind introduction. And well, hello, very nice to be here joining you on this panel. And I really appreciate the participants of this panel. I mean, getting started is the first step for everything. So thank you for your interest. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how it fits into this, the priorities of the United Nations. I mean, I think we'll all agree that the world we live in now has changed radically over the past couple of years. And so with that, the capabilities of the people in our organization really need to evolve. So the Secretary General acknowledged that, and I mean, Mary already talked about his guidance note on behavioral science, which was issued last year. But behavioral science is one of the this group of what we call next generation skills that we would really like to encourage the organization and people in it to develop. So what are these next generation skills? They are data, innovation, digital, strategic foresight, and of course, behavioral science. Adapting our organizations in to match the needs of today and make us ready for increasingly complex challenges we face in the future is so important, and I think you all agree on that. And in line with the recommendations in Secretary General's report, our common agenda, and I hope that you all had a chance to read it, we need to do everything we can to become a 21st century organization. And I find that even myself, we're still using kind of tools from 19th century, but we need to be more nimble, dynamic, and effective. And then behavioral science is one of those newer and perhaps less well-known tools of what we're calling new generation or UN 2.0. But it's so useful for us to enable us to do our jobs better, to do better programming, to better inform our decisions. And the potential it holds to really improve our mandate delivery is just so vast. So since so much of the work of the United Nations relies on changing behavior, including any of our health interventions, including taking medicine, allowing a child to attend school, halting violence and reaching agreements, understanding how people actually behave and make decisions is so essential. And behavioral science enables us to diagnose barriers, and there's so many barriers. I think we will see that in our day-to-day lives, preventing people from taking action, understanding incentives that can help people to achieve their aims and design and measure the impact of interventions on the basis of these assessments. That really will shift the needle and do things much better and in a more effective way. So for us, the UN behavioral science techniques are already helping us to improve collaboration across our humanitarian development and peace operations in the fragile settings where we cannot afford siloed thinking. But we need more inclusive, integrated, and impactful approaches. Together with behavioral science experts, for example, we have identified 7 barriers to successful integration that are supporting our most senior leaders and how they can overcome them. I'm just using this as an example of how we used behavioral science to address one of the most important priorities of the Secretary General, which is to enhance integrated cross-pillar work across the system. So today we're joined by a panelist who will follow me, and I think that they will be sharing with you some of the insights that they have gained across their experiences to give you some very good ideas on how to get started, how to form partnerships, and how to embed BSide in your respective entities. And I think that you will have a very fruitful dialogue with them. Please use the Q&A and chat function to interact with the panelists. I'm very excited that the panelists have decided to join this session. I'm also looking forward to learning from them. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you so much again for the invitation to join you today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for those remarks, Ayaka. It really helps to situate ourselves in the week and kind of the broader efforts of the Secretary General. Thank you. Okay, so with that, thanks, Ayaka. I'm going to share one more slide, which has our panelists with us. So today we're very fortunate to have with us, as Ayaka mentioned, a panel of 3 individuals who have applied behavioral science in different contexts in different ways, ranging from governments through to the UN system itself. So first we'll hear from Ivan Badassi, who's the president, he's from the Office of the President Argentina, where he leads the Behavioral Science and Public Policy Unit. So this unit is a very exciting one. It's one of the few in the Global South. So we're very excited to hear from his experiences. It's about a year old, if I'm correct. There's been a lot of work in the lead up to this. So we're keen to hear from Ivan about how you got started and how things really came into fruition there. Second, we'll hear from Gina Lucarelli, and so she's the team leader in UNDP Accelerator Lab Network. And if you've been involved in innovation in the UN over the last few years, I think it's pretty fair to say you've probably come across Gina and her work. So we're very fortunate to have her with us today. And just briefly, she has a wide, varied background, but she's worked in human rights and development for over 20 years with a ton of experience in the UN. So very keen to hear from Gina as well. And then lastly, we'll hear from Laura de Molière, who's from the UK Cabinet Office. She's the head of behavioral science there. Her work focuses in the area of communications, and she's a behavioral scientist herself. She has her PhD in decision science and social cognition, so she can also speak to some of the technical aspects of behavioral science as well. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing and ask that our panelists turn their cameras on. Great, thank you, perfect, it's all working. Okay, so I'm going to go through a series of questions, and as I mentioned, Ayaka said as well, please put your questions in the chat. There'll be opportunities to ask our panelists afterward, but I will ask them some first, as in the privilege that I have. So first, we just do a round of telling us a bit about your, a little bit about your organizations and your work applying behavioral science. So first, can we start with Gina? What does your organization's approach to applying behavioral science, and what does your team and structure look like?
Thanks so much, Mary, and great to be here with all of you. I see some familiar names in the audience, and many of you who have a lot to contribute and know an awful lot about this topic. So as Ayaka said, we are kind of in this moment of planetary crisis, and our sort of hypothesis is, at UNDP, when it comes to innovation in times of planetary crisis, best practices don't always exist. And what you need to do is enable experimentation to figure out what works. We recently launched a new strategic plan at the UN Development Program, and the focus is all on systems transformation. Truth is, nobody knows how to do systems transformation, and so it naturally requires research and development, experimentation, exploration, and this is a continuous function. So I steward a network of 91 social innovation labs, which are embedded inside the United Nations Development Program, and their mandate is really to reimagine development, for the 21st century. In terms of structure, we take a portfolio approach. So we try to advance behavioral insights, behavioral science as one form of intervention among many. Positive deviance are others, hackathons, systems thinking, foresight, alternative futures. Every time you try and categorize these innovation methods, they grow and change. But we do take this sort of portfolio approach where, yes, behavioral drivers are a part of systems transformation, but so are regulatory drivers, technological drivers, economic drivers, cultural drivers, et cetera. So this is largely sort of where we are. We have, as I said, 91 social innovation labs. Inside each lab, a bit about the structure there, because that's really what drives the experimentation, including behavioral experimentation. We put a big premium on sourcing knowledge and practices from women and men who are facing the effects of climate change and living in poverty, which is why in each lab we have someone who's an ethnographer, maybe a journalist background, sociologist, and their full-time job is learn from people who we're trying to help. We also have a data capacity. So we have a head of exploration who might be a data scientist, might be a partnership advisor, et cetera. They're looking at weak signals of change, tapping into new sources of data, and bringing that work in. And then it's the head of experimentation who then takes this intelligence from the knowledge and practice of people closest to the problem and, new sources of data, evolving change, and designs tests, designs experiments to push hypotheses. So what we've seen is behavioral insights, even though it wasn't sort of promoted as a specific method to be used within the range of many innovation methods, it has gotten a lot of traction. Especially when people try and take on systemic issues, they often realize that the biggest gap in the current portfolio is comes to behavior, right? That printing brochures doesn't change behavior, right? So this is where we've seen a lot of labs working on waste management, circular economy, marine litter issues, trying to switch from single-use plastic bags. And there inevitably is a behavioral experimentation approach in Ghana, Philippines, Libya, many others. And this is sort of this is an entry point for them, coming into an issue which you can visibly see in the community. You know that there is a behavioral factor to it in terms of segregating waste, or changing, whether you use a cloth bag or a plastic bag, or whether you pollute the ocean or not. There's a strong behavioral element, and that's how the labs come in and start their work in this area.
Great, thank you for that, Gina. Really fascinating model about how you're bringing all these different disciplines together. And I think all the panelists will probably agree, this is what we should be doing, is interacting with other areas, not just experimentation, talking to ethnographers, talking to other people as well. So it's really, you can check out that model. And we can put in the chat the link to the Accelerator Labs website, because there's a lot on there to explore in more detail for those who are interested. Okay, so next over to Yvonne. Could you please tell us about your organization and how you're applying behavioral science, as well as what your team structure looks like? Oh, did we lose Yvonne? Okay, great.
Okay, here, my goodness, as usual, glitch comes from nowhere. So you presented me, Mary?
Yes, sorry, I cut out a little bit there. So what is your organization's approach to applying behavioral science, and what does your team and structure look like?
Well, first of all, thank you for asking us to come, because as you know, those we run these kind of offices are kind of amphibious characters that try to swim in the dark waters of politics, bureaucracy, and we have an academic background. And some of the things that you usually hear from the first world countries are so far away of our daily practice that to chat about how to begin, for us, it's very, very important. So to begin with, as you told, our office has only 1 year old. It was created on July the 20th of last year. And since the beginning, what we try to do is to go by the book. We see the academic literature, for example, the most notorious Inside the NAT unit, Harper's book. And we also have the company of the BIT, the Behavioural Science team of the UK, in order to help us to set the unit. And we try to gain momentum from the beginning, following Halpern's advices. For example, we are embedded in the office of the president. He came personally to our inauguration in the first term, and that was, as you know, as bureaucracy, it's quite vertical. If you have the president there, it seems that something important is going to happen. So that was a great thing. The other thing, we have a kind of champion minister that he has a lot of experience in the international institutions working with behavioral insights, so he quite managed the matter. And on the other hand, we are a federal government, we are in the central structure of the office of the president, and we try to get in contact with all levels of government, with ministers at the minister and second tier bureaucracy at the federal level, but also provinces and municipalities. And the thing is, as you know, Latin American countries are not really known for having a solid and stable institutional structures. And on top of that, there's a political pervasive divide everywhere, not only in Argentina. So we have our neighbor, Uruguay, set with a very fine leader and with a lot of political support and a behavioral unit, but afterwards the government changed and the unit is not working nowadays. So every day when we wake up in the morning, what we are trying is to build evidence in order to secure the continuity of the unit in the future. We are still trying to go by the book and to do all of what the academic literature suggests to do in these stages. But the question is, will it suffice? We will try to find it later, Mary, when our encounter continues.
Great, thank you for that. Really interesting about starting in the president's office and how that can really help kickstart a lot of your work initiatives. And maybe we can get into it a little bit later, but I found it really interesting how you're able to engage with partners in Argentina as well from the academics in the country too. So maybe we can come into that a little bit later, how you're doing the projects that you're carrying out. And on to Laura now for her work in the UK government. What's your approach and what does your team structure look like?
Thank you. So I'm heading the behavioral science team here in the Cabinet Office, and our team, we're 7 people. We've grown over the last 3 years. When I set up the team, we are essentially having a consultancy model. So we're consulting policymakers and communicators on their project throughout the entirety of the UK government. That's to say that in the UK, there are over 20 different teams in the different kind of ministries. So there's quite a lot of really specific knowledge that everyone can draw on. But we are kind of filling the gaps and working with those ministries that don't have their own teams, and providing particularly advice in situations where there's a crisis and it has to be quite fast. With regards to kind of how I set up the team, it's possibly slightly different to other teams in the sense that I realized quite quickly that a lot of the traditional behavioral insights approaches where, you know, you're changing the way you present information and anything like that is actually covered to quite a large extent already with regards to marketeers that really know how to run a campaign. And then we have a lot of analysts in government, thousands of them, in fact, that know how to run a randomized control trials. So my team actually, given the small size of us, we're not collecting any primary data, but instead partner with existing analysts and researchers to kind of make these projects. But I think the key shift for me has been that rather than us focusing on interventions and trying to figure out how we can, provide knowledge on getting people to do something, I have realized that the bigger value for us is to focus on problem definition. So actually understanding problems from a behavioral perspective. What should the world look like in which you've enacted all your change? Who is involved in that? What is the system surrounding people? And we've mentioned, we've heard barriers a lot. What are the barriers? And can we overcome them with a campaign? Can we overcome it with legislation? What is the right lever to use? And how can we enable people in government from different professions to work together on these problems? And apart from that, we've also kind of focused on adapting behavioral science to the organization's needs. So I mentioned speed. A lot of the times we have to input into, really fast moving crisis with half an hour, 2-hour deadlines. So it's very fast. So it has to completely change the model and how we work. And we also focus quite a lot on R&D and more novel ways of encouraging the roles of behavioral scientists. For instance, one of our big focuses is on reducing unintended behavioral consequences on interventions that you put out, which of course is also really relevant to a UN audience where, do no harm is quite at the center of many of your endeavors. So yeah, that's us.
Great, thanks for that. There's a lot to unpack in there, but I mean, for the sake of the conversation, I'll say it's really interesting how you've been able to leverage your team and the existing resources of government outside. That's a really interesting insight I think we can all reflect upon. And yeah, giving fast-paced advice, I think this is something that has pushed the field of behavioral science in the recent years. So I'm curious to hear more from you on that as we go ahead. Okay, so if there aren't any questions for our panelists, well, if they do, maybe we'll go to the next question. So going back to Gina, what are some success factors you could highlight to others who are thinking about getting started with behavioral science? So you mentioned all these labs you set up, over 90 of them. That's quite remarkable. I'm sure each context is different and many, huge understatement in saying that. So what factors might you want to highlight for others who are at early stages?
Yeah, I would say the most important thing you can do is kind of ensure there is some kind of mandate for experimentation within your organization, right? That's protected. And of course, the best mandates are not unfunded mandates, but funded mandates, which is why, I, coming from, having worked in innovation a bit and then coming to UNDP and seeing the, we're doing this on a big scale kind of attitude, I was just really excited and refreshed by that, because it means, here's the funding, here's the mandate, take it. But you've got to protect that mandate to experiment. And that also means reconsidering how you monitor success and failure, right? So you've got to, I don't think you're ever going to get to a situation in the public sector on day one where you have a 95% failure tolerance, right? You're never going to get to that. But at least implying sort of Nelson Mandela's famous words that, I never fail. I either win, or I learn. Right. And I think if you kind of focus on that learning, it's really, really critical, because then you can say, you know what, we know that this doesn't make people stop using single-use plastic bags, but these other things might, right? So we're kind of closer to the zone. The other thing I would say, particularly with behavioral insights, is you're always dealing with people who come from some kind of background. And if you're trying to pitch to them to try something new, find something in their background that resonates, right? They might have had a psychology professor they really loved and they, enjoyed that. So they might have some kind of feeling we should be learning more from psychology and appeal to that. They might have, a communications background where they're tired of just printing brochures and expecting behavior to change. Or they might be someone who feels we need more rigor and more seriousness in how we advise governments on what they should and shouldn't be doing, right? They might be someone who needs the data, who needs the rigor, who needs the research. Try and appeal to that. So I wouldn't sort of come in saying, I read this great book and I think we've been doing everything wrong and we should change it because I had an epiphany, but rather sort of, bring them in from where they start. And then finally, I would say, I think when you're just getting your first behavioral insight experiment off the ground, there's a bit of a choice in what kind of topic you pick. And I don't think there's a rule of thumb on this. I think you have to kind of read the situation, but you may want to pick something a little under the radar that allows you to, the experiment to fail and without massive repercussions. That might be, your assessment of the best approach. Or you might want to speak directly to a problem that is top drawer that everybody's trying to figure out and has kind of, if you have a problem that people have admitted, we don't really know the solutions, that's also a good space to start with experimentation in this field. So it's a choice between, I want to fly under the radar, or I want to go right to where people are frustrated and throw this new thing at it. That's what I would suggest.
Wow, a lot of compelling insights and only a few minutes of comments, Gina. Thank you for that. Experimentation is key, and finding partners who get it and understand it, not only the importance of it, but how to do it as well. And then also this comment about meeting people where they are and having the right pitch and having the right sell and really kind of seeing the value of behavioral science in different contexts, because you're very right in that doesn't add value in the same ways for everyone. And really interesting point about choosing projects as well. I've heard talk about, choosing low-hanging fruit projects, maybe ones that are easier to have results that you can guarantee versus others that'll be more complicated and challenging to actually a bit more uncertain whether you would have an impact or the experiment might not work. So really, really interesting there. So are there any other comments from our panelists before I go on? Okay. Ivan, over to you. What are some success factors you'd like to highlight for others who are getting started?
Well, I think that one thing that we have, it's our storytelling is great. We have this different style, the wit of Ariely, or the irony and humor of Thaler, or the sweet persuasiveness of my behavioralist hero, Sunstein. We have lots of things to tell, and histories are compelling. So we can work with that, and we have a huge impact with that. Obviously, this can have a drawback. That is that when you speak with politicians or bureaucracy, they think that you have a box of magician tricks and that you can pull a rabbit out of your hat in 3 days. After the good news and the nice stories, you have to tell them that you have to check data, that you have to do RCTs. That's then we can speak about that later. It's not very usual in our cultural and academic environment, and especially within bureaucracy and public policy in Argentina and in Latin America. So you have these great storytelling stories to go ahead and to convince people, but be careful, be humble when you tell this. I told about my own experience because I get too enthusiastic in telling some stories, and then when you have to calm down bureaucrats and politicians in order to control their anxieties. Second, try to engage academia and the consultancy sector. These have some problems in our environment, but the the worst thing you can do is not to hear them and to speak directly with bureaucracy. You have to build some capacities within your, not only within your government, but within academia and consultancy sector. We run a experiment here. We make a contest where we awarded to 10 universities that work with cities or ministries in order to work with us. It's not the traditional the traditional loan where you expect for the results. We are hands-on the projects. We are advising them. We are helping them in order to build the custom of work with our behavioral tools. And what the third thing is what Laura says or told us about the British government. We didn't expect that in a first stage we were going to find some partners where with whom we can build some units or small units to work with us in other fields. For example, in Córdoba, it's a province that is 100 kilometers from Buenos Aires. We are working with some people that's fighting with addiction in that province. On the other hand, we have a very good rapport with a health unit in the Ministry of Health, because they are accustomed of working with RCTs. So this is another thing that was unexpected for us at these early moments, to find key partners within the administration, and we help them to set their own units, and we try to be in the best of both worlds. We have a hands-off control of them, and we help them. And on the other hand, they have the specialization that they know their field, and they're working very hard within their own offices. So that's the three aspects that we were very keen on seeing how it develops in our unit.
Great, thank you very much for that. Again, very important critical points to bring across. Storytelling, managing expectations are also important, and a lot of that you learn by doing yourself, and how you pitch different ideas with different audiences, and then really engaging with partners. I think that's really key, as you mentioned, with academia and consultancies and across the government too. How you do that is so important. So I'd just like to point the attention to the Q&A box. I see some questions coming in, not to our panelists, but to our audience. If you are keen on certain questions, please upvote the ones you want to hear the responses to at the end. So I'll just flag that for you at this point in time, but we'll be coming to those questions in the latter part of our session today. So with that, on to Laura. What are some key success factors you'd like to highlight for others who are getting started?
Yes, I think my first reflection is that behavioral science is so beautiful to me because it is so varied. And I would like to kind of just broaden out the discussion briefly to stay away from just associating behavioral science with experimentation. I think the two are actually, in some ways they've been linked historically, because behavioral scientists also want to demonstrate their own impact by running randomized control trials and comparing themselves against the control group. And experimentation is clearly important, but it's not possible in all circumstances. And I think sometimes it actually distracts from behavioral scientists being engaged in very early stages of decision-making and understanding of problems that they could otherwise contribute. I guess my first kind of lesson learned is here that as a behavioral scientist, kind of starting up new, the first project that you have is actually understanding your organizational needs around behavioral science, and to not be tied to existing blueprints of what behavioral science looks like. So is the need of your organization more experimentation and kind of evidence-based decision-making, policy making? You might go there. Is your need better problem analysis? You go there. Is your need better marketing? You go there. Essentially, you are analyzing the decision-making processes of your organization as your unit of analysis, and you see where you can contribute. And I think having this kind of clear mission statement and problem to solve has really helped focus us around kind of ensuring that we're making better assumptions about behavior as part of our internal decision-making processes. And that enabled us to move upstream, to move into rooms where behavioral scientists usually are not, because they're associated with the implementation and the downstream thing and randomized control trials. I don't really believe in this kind of moment where behavioral scientists go, ooh, is this a behavioral problem? Can I contribute? I think actually every problem is behavioral. I've yet to come across one that is not, if you take internal decision-making into account. So from that perspective, I think behavioral scientists, if they have the confidence to go and say, I can help solve problems in whatever shape or form. I am not bound to an existing model. I am not bound to solutions that have worked elsewhere, and I'm trying frantically to try and implement them in a different area. I am bound to my brain and I can help with this. That's where I think personally I've seen the most success factors of behavioral science teams in the UK government. And the final thing is, we mentioned kind of the low-hanging fruits. My intuition around this, and just to preempt, my team started on the not so low-hanging fruit that was Brexit. Very complex, very political, very difficult, kind of new land for behavioral scientists in some ways. I think that low-hanging fruit often aren't as low-hanging as we think. So sometimes there are very clear cases, of course. But in other ways, you end up kind of annoying some people that have such good knowledge, actually, even about the behavior in your organization. So my intuition has always been to look for problems that are really hard. And rather than promise to solve them, say, I'm going to help you look at this problem. I'm going to bring you some new perspective. I'm going to ask you questions you've not asked before. And I'm going to shine light from a behavioral science perspective onto this problem that can help further the discussion. So yeah, I think those are my reflections.
Great, thanks for that, Laura. Pushing our thinking further, as always, the field of behavioral science and our thinking across this panel. So I think it's really important, as you said, to meet the organization where it is. I mean, is it experimentation you need? Is it marketing? Is it something else? I think that's so key. And oftentimes we think, what have others done? It's been 10 years, more than that, of this in practice, instead of reflecting on what our organizations actually need. And yeah, a lot of problems are behavioral for sure. Some are structural more than behavioral, but definitely we can look at things from behavioral perspective as well. So that's important to keep in mind. And yeah, choosing projects, not to be afraid of choosing harder ones, mindful of skill sets that we have, but also, yeah, definitely behavioral science can contribute in different ways. So with that, if panelists don't have any comments for each other, I'll go on to the next question. No? Okay. So now we've spoken about some of the successes, and it's not always success in this field. Obviously, lots of challenges in applying behavioral science. So what are some challenges you face going from initial stages to more increased use of behavioral science in your organizations? And even if you're still working on them right now, how are you addressing them? Or if you have overcome them, how have you overcome them? So with that, I'll return to Gina. How are things in Accelerator Labs?
Thanks, Mary. I think the biggest, well, there's two sort of challenges I would find. One is if you're trying to embed a specific method into a public sector organization, which is often, strapped in terms of human resources, budgets, etc. I find you get more traction when you talk about the problem space or the opportunity rather than the method. Right. So if you can focus on what you are now able to do rather than enshrining and protecting this new way of working. Right. I think at the beginning you need to protect that, but it's not a long-term strategy. Right. So if you're able to rather talk about, OK, what we now know is, in Lebanon, they're experiencing enormous energy shortages, as a lot of places around the world. It's a huge opportunity to grow renewable energy. We now know, based on this work in behavioral science, where, how to market this best to who and where we can get the pickup and take advantage of this opportunity, rather than sort of saying, putting the method up front, right? At least within the UN Development Program, we have people who are focused on, getting 500 million people access to sustainable energy by 2025. They, quite frankly, don't care how it's done. They just want to know that it can be done and figure that out. So shifting to kind of the learning and the insights which speak to the mission of your organization, I think is a tricky one. And the other one, and I don't know, just to throw this in there because it might inspire some debate. One experience that we had is, so we work on sustainable development as a distributed problem, right? It's a problem of 8 billion people around the world making micro decisions and taking actions that will determine whether future generations, can meet their development needs and can live, in peace and equitably and sustainably. So it's a massively distributed problem. We have tried to promote the idea of collective intelligence, meaning that those 8 billion people around the world have a lot to contribute. They know a lot because they're closest to the action on, transport systems, how to grow crops, etc. So we try this kind of bottom-up approach. And we find sometimes that behavioral science is seen as a top-down approach, right? It's seen as an approach that understands, people's mentalities and needs to sort of promote a change or nudge them from the top down, right? So this bottom up, top down dance is a bit of a challenge in the sense that, in my experience, behavioral science is seen as that. Whereas you have sort of other methods which are more like participatory, more acknowledging the agency and the sort of knowledge that people have. These sort of, need to come and meet in the middle.
Very interesting about how we can actually work within organizations to do this. And there's the ground, there's the bottom, and there's the top, middle, to the middle layer too, and how you can get everyone engaged is a very interesting question. So lots there to explore. I'll leave it, maybe panelists have other comments to make on that as well. But before anyone else jumps in, I'll ask Yvonne, what are some challenges you face going from the initial stages? You said you're about a year old to where you are now, and what challenges are you currently addressing in your increased use of application in behavioral science?
Well, I've once heard a quotation by Dan Ariely that says that behavioral sciences are like teenage sex, that many say they are doing that, but very few are actually doing it. And the thing is that I found in my daily practice a lot of that. For example, in the academia, and I blame myself in the first place for that, because I worked since have a life-changing meeting with Sansense in 2002. I work a lot in what I thought it was behavioral science, but what's only theoretical. We have not in our environment we are not doing RCTs. We are not working on the ground, and many of our academia thinks they are doing behavioral sciences, but they don't have the experience of changing from theoretical to practical and to have some feet on the ground experiences. And we have a catchphrase in our unit when we work with the organizations. Well, we are doing what you are suggesting. We are sending messages. We are trying to speak with people. Many of the things that we're trying to change some defaults because, as you know, that the things that many of our books are bestsellers and lots of people read Thinking Fast and Slow or Predictably Irrational or something like that, and they think they are doing this, but without the whole set of tools that we need to use when we are working seriously in behavioral economics. And the third thing I can mention is that there's some one thing that we think it's very useful and it elevates what we are doing is the support of the international organization. But in our environment, there's a lot of skepticism about my pronunciation, oh my God, of the participation of international institutions. Some of the structural changes suggested in the 90s, the privatization and something like that in certain fields of academia and bureaucracy, things that they are not a very good seeing this organization. And they are, when you speak about RCTs or to try new practices, we have two problems. First, they think, well, are you using us as guinea pigs? And that's one thing. And the other is that is a well-known bias that what we work with, is that the sunk cost fallacy. They invested so much in preparing in another field that it's very difficult for them to change or to see things in other ways. So trying to be humble, trying to collect evidence in order to convince them, and try to find the key partners in every organization is the main defiance that we have when we are working within the bureaucracy and the academia. It's not an easy task, but we are having very good results in some of them and some drawbacks also, but that's life.
Great, thank you for that. Lots of interesting insights, especially your comments about just people understanding what behavioral science is and isn't. It's fundamental to what we're trying to talk about here, and to communicate that can be challenging. And I think you keep coming back to this notion of being humble or humility, which is this core value in a lot of behavioral science work. So yeah, being humble and having humility about how you talk about it is core as well. So thank you for that.
Excuse me, Mary.
Yeah.
One thing that we always try to convince our partners that we have not the solution. I always speak about the Katie Milkman's experiment about vaccines, that they ran 30 or 40 messages, and they made the same mistake as the lay people in order to see how they will work better. So it's not that we are, and Gina spoke about this, not this top-down approach to the problems. Well, we both have to work together in order to see how it works and what is going to work in your field. But we are not preaching something that is established. We have to try, we have to experiment and then see what's better for you. Context is the word that we try to use in every environment that we work here in Latin America and in Argentina. Sorry for interrupting.
No, very helpful, very, very helpful to say how to bring everyone along with us. You know, this, as we've spoken about the wide variety of methods we're using, and the context is so important. We need to bring people with us. It's not a one. There's a reason why many behavioral science teams are not just one skill set. When people ask, what is a behavioral scientist? Their skills range and backgrounds range in teams. So very interesting and helpful point there as well. Okay, now on to Laura and the UK government. What are some challenges you faced going from the initial stages to where you are now, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to mention 2 points, just so we have a bit of time for Q&A as well. The first is that whenever you are going to bring in behavioral science expertise into your organization, there's a very large chance that the size of the team will be outstripped dramatically by the size of the organization and by the potential problems that are to be solved. So you're then in a moment where, as a team, you possibly have to turn away quite a lot of projects that might actually be quite valuable to you. And if you're turning away people over time, then you'll end up in a position where they might go elsewhere or stop approaching you, and that's obviously not great. So we had this challenge on a really large scale because there are so many civil servants and 7 of us. One thing that we are doing quite extensensively is when people are approaching us, to ensure that we're giving them half-an-hour slots with us. We call them surgeries, to help them think about the problem from a behavioral perspective. And a lot of the time, actually, bit of the heavy lifting is already done to kind of set up people and bring them on a path where they can apply behavioral science thinking quite early on in their projects themselves. So that's been important, as is the ability of a behavioral science team to prioritize. And I think one really important factor is kind of how much impact can I have in this project. And it needs expertise to judge how far removed, how behavioral the project already is. If it's very behavioral, then your impact will be obviously less than if it's completely non-behavioral. And getting a good understanding of that has been very useful. And the second point for me is that something that's been really clear to me from the start is that actually we, as an internal team, we are looking at the behavior of those people, policymakers, communicators, that are then trying to change behavior in the general population, right? So actually the immediate behavior changes we are trying to envision are amongst us. It's the system within which we as organizations make decisions. So from that perspective, I think it's been really important for us to focus quite heavily on understanding internal decision-making processes, understanding where wrong assumptions or non-evidence assumptions about behaviors are being baked in, what are the factors that, are barriers for your colleagues to engage with evidence in a certain way, or to resolve some of those trade-offs that you as a behavioral scientist think should be resolved. And that's been a really huge part of what we do. And I think the mindset that helped me get there has always been kind of that behavioral science, actually the end game isn't that there is this small team that provides great service to an organization. The end game is an organization that works differently and embedding behavioral science in a different way. So for me, it's more of a movement than a service.
Great. Very helpful points there, Laura. Surgery is something that we've heard about from a variety of behavioral science teams in terms of how they can spread their expertise and different ways of doing that. And also, yeah, a lot of it's about organizational change. And maybe I see there's a question in the Q&A, so I'll maybe come back to that point in a second for you, Laura, but thanks for that. Okay, so in the few minutes we have left here, I think I have at least one question for each of our panelists, and then we'll see if there's a broader one at the end for all of you. So the first few questions are for Gina. So there was quite a bit of interest in accelerator labs when you mentioned it and shared your post or your website. So what are the next steps for accelerator labs, and what are some of the most surprising findings you've had based on the behavioral science work you've carried out? Yeah, examples of projects people are keen to hear more about, specifically what you've done.
Sure. So in terms of, maybe I'll start from the end and go backwards. So in terms of examples of projects, so the way the Accelerator Lab Network works is that all the labs work on whatever development problem they want to, largely in whatever way they want to, as long as they're pushing the boundaries, experimenting, exploring, and tapping into local knowledge and practices. So it's a pretty broad remit. So surprisingly, we've seen a lot of work in waste management. This is not a major organizational priority for UNDP. UNDP does work on the circular economy and on environmental issues, and in certain contexts, waste management systems, but it's not, top tier priority. It seems to have come up, in Kenya and Ghana and Vietnam. It's a very visible problem that then you can work with municipalities on sort of close to the issue and start to map it, start to see the waste management system. One of the big surprises there is how much informality drives those waste management systems. So you have a lot of informal waste pickers who are the ones segregating waste. They are the ones doing it, which means that when you have teams like Ghana who are trying to get more people to segregate their waste for recycling, knowing that recycling is not the issue and we should be cutting off our addiction to plastic in the first place, it means that in order to see the waste management system, they have to sort of map it, and they have to acknowledge that informality in the first place, right? Because it's a place that is, if you want to drive more value from waste, it's the informal economy that's kind of driving in many ways the circular economy, right? In that respect. So that's been kind of a surprise. And that's led us to make actually informality our research and development priority. So again, we let all the labs do what they do, but we try and find the patterns across the network of 91 labs. So we sit back and we say, okay, it seems that informality is coming up, not just in waste management, but in many other issues. In COVID response, informal networks were very effective in providing social solidarity. In reducing youth unemployment, a lot of the job growth is in informal sectors. So we've made informality our research and development priority, and that's sort of largely what's happening and coming next. Right now, we're looking at, there's been a rapid digitalization that's happened even in informal markets because of the pandemic. So because of the shutdown of physical space, a lot of e-commerce platforms have grown, and not just for the middle class and not just for more established shops, but also for informal vendors. So we're trying to understand what that means for them and what a better approach to informality is, because the current approach needs some R&D. The assumption is if you have parts of your informal economy, your GDP should develop it and it should go away and everything should get, neat and dusted. And that doesn't seem to be the case, even for high income countries. So we need a bit of a switch.
Great, thank you for that. Really interesting examples and good to hear where Accelerator Labs is going. And as we shared in the link earlier, Gina shared it. So if you want to know more about those examples or others, there are blog posts, there's a lot on there. I encourage you to check out their website. I go to it frequently to find various examples of behavioral science across the UN. So thank you for that, Gina, very helpful. And next question maybe I'll combine a few for Yvonne, if that's all right. So we have some questions from students who are interested in particularly opportunities in the Global South. How can students and academics get involved in working with behavioral science units? So you've spoken about how you engage with academics, but from an academic standpoint, how could they engage with you and others? Maybe some tips there would be helpful. And also when it comes to areas where, maybe we spoke about the spectrum of behavioral science background. So qualitative, quantitative, law, PhDs, medical degrees, right? Everyone's in what advice might you have for people who don't have a psychology or a traditional background? Any advice you might have, particularly given your background as a lawyer too, so how you came into this field? So a bit of a winded question there, but hopefully that you can comment on something there.
Well, I'm old enough not to have, when I studied the spectacular curriculum that you have now, that you have specific master degree and formation in behavioral sciences. I came from, that's why I spoke so keenly about Kazansen, because he's also an administrative lawyer. We work in regulation, and when we begin to challenge the rational aspect of regulation and the rational models that was embedded from economics into law, well, that's the way that we change that. But as Laura points out, the marvelous thing about behavioral science is that you have to have lots of inputs. So in our unit, I'm the only lawyer, but we have lots of, not lots because we are a very small unit, but we are trying to get inputs from psychology, and we're trying to find good quantitative analysts, and we have to work together with all of that. And let me jump with one of the Q&A that was in our chat, is that they asked who were the most reluctant to work with you, and which are good partners. Well, we found, as I told you, a very good partners within the health sector. Perhaps because they are under siege because of COVID, but I think that the main thing is that they are used to make RCTs. And the other thing is that they also try, we have some problems when they have this investment in studying and working all their lives in certain fields, and to change the way to see things, it's very, very difficult. So if I had to point out a sector, the health sector is a very good partner, and the other, you have to go with prudence and humility in order not to offend them.
Yes, very good point. I think there were lots of lessons learned from COVID working in behavioral science about there's public health expertise, there's behavioral science expertise, and it's bringing it all to the table. Very, very interesting, helpful points there. Thank you very much for that. And there are many questions. I don't think we can get to all of them. Unfortunately, we're already a minute over time, but if our panelists can stick with us for a couple more minutes, I have one more question for Laura, and it picks up on the point she made just at the end of her remarks regarding the organization and how behavioral science fits into the broader organizational work. And then, so maybe expanding on that a little bit, but then also how behavioral science can be applied to improve organizations themselves. Have you done work on that? Maybe in your communications background that you have, just elaborating on those points would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So the question that's asked is phrased slightly ambiguously. So it can either be understood as kind of how we're applying behavioral science to organizational behavior more broadly, or how we're looking with behavioral science at how behavioral science is applied in organizations. I'm going to try and answer the first question, which is, when it comes to organizations and how they behave, obviously organizations are people. So there isn't a thing of an organization, but organizations break down into different people that have different roles in organizations. And if we say analyze the behavior of, say, an SME or like a small medium enterprise or anything like that, we would usually go and understand what are the kind of outcomes we'd like to see from this organization, who within the organization has actually the decision-making power, and what are the internal processes. So a lot of that is actually comes back to mapping the internal decision-making processes and understanding who has what role regarding to the problem or the broader outcome, to then understand what are the barriers in the way of either are structurally or behaviorally, and then what can governments or others do to intervene to support them to kind of make the decision in line with how you think they should be making them. So sorry, that was quite abstract, but essentially breaking it down on a kind of concrete behavioral level and understanding internal decision-making processes has always been the broad approach that has got us to a point where we can understand it better.
Great, thank you for that. I think, yeah, I could have answered that in many different angles, and you've done a great job of succinctly conveying that. So thank you for that, Laura. And it looks like we've gone over time. So unfortunately, we'll have to close it out for today, but thank you very much to our panel for joining us and their spectrum of experiences ranging from the UN to outside, and many, many years of working in this area amongst all of you. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. Before I close it out, is there anything that the panelists would like to share with the audience before we leave? If not, that's fine as well. Okay.
Well, for all the audience to feel free to contact our unit, because we need to think together on how we can continue working with behavioral sciences and how to let the unit survive next governments and the political divide that it's affecting everywhere, and to try to put behavioral science out of this divide.
Great. Thanks for that. Another common to working together, which is what we're aiming to do in these webinars. Anything from Laura and Gina? That's fine as well, if not. Okay, well, great. Oh.
Yeah, no, it's fine. No, I just also kind of offer for people to contact me with any questions around how to set up behavioral science teams. I'm more than happy to help where we can.
Okay. Okay, well, with that, I will close it out for today. Thank you very much for joining, and looking forward to seeing you at other events that we host. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Mary.
Thank you very much.
Laura, thank you,
all.
Great to
Laura,
be
Mary.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.